Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moment in every life, no matter how fast it accelerates, no matter how high it climbs, when velocity alone stops being enough. Even the most powerful engines eventually need stabilization. Even the brightest minds require grounding. And even the wildest spirits, the ones that seek to reshape planets and rewrite the physics of possibility, discover eventually that they are still human, still wired with the exquisite fragility and brilliance of the human nervous system. Tonight, I want to talk about that moment, a moment when a mind racing at orbital speed meets a force stronger than momentum, a force that doesn't slow it down, but steadies it, a force that doesn't pull it back to Earth, but gives it a center of gravity so precise that it sharpens vision and amplifies clarity. I want to talk about the individual, the rare kind of individual, who can ground a spirit so relentlessly untamed that even the universe seems like a small canvas. You see, when we look at people who attempt the impossible, we tend to focus on their output. We obsess over their innovations, their forward motion, their so-called genius. But neuroscience reveals an uncomfortable truth: the brain is not designed to operate in perpetual acceleration. Cortisol rises, neural networks destabilize, creativity cracks under pressure when there is no emotional equilibrium. Even the most resilient prefrontal cortex, the seat of logic, planning, and strategic imagination, begins to misfire without grounding stimuli. And for someone whose internal world operates like a constantly humming electric grid, grounding doesn't come from silence, nor from solitude. It comes from resonance, from another human being whose nervous system communicates safety, stability, and coherence. It comes from the rare connection where two brains synchronize their oscillations, not in the slow rhythms of rest, but in the dynamic frequencies of trust. Trust is not just an emotion, it is a neurological event. In fact, we can measure it. Oxytocin levels rise. The amygdala, the brain's danger detector, softens. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex gains sharper executive control. The brain becomes not slower, but more efficient. And when this happens to someone driven by a relentless internal engine, the effect is astonishing. Their creativity doesn't diminish, it multiplies. Their boldness doesn't calm, it becomes calibrated. Their ambition doesn't shrink, it becomes concentrated. The world often misunderstands this. It thinks grounding is about taming, but grounding is not taming. Grounding is alignment, the precise alignment of energy, intentions, and cognition. When the right person steps into the life of someone who is constantly oscillating between brilliance and burnout, they don't dim the light, they redirect it. There are some people whose presence is like atmospheric stabilization, subtle but essential. You only notice the difference when they're gone, and then suddenly the air feels thinner, the thoughts feel louder, and the brain feels like it's spinning faster than the body can tolerate. But when they are near, something extraordinary happens. The mind finds its rhythm again. Goals become clearer, emotions become quieter, decisions straighten themselves out. This is not poetic exaggeration, this is science. In the last 20 years, neuroscience has made remarkable progress in understanding interpersonal neurobiology, the way two nervous systems can lock into synchrony. In high-performing individuals, especially those with hyperactive cognitive patterns, this synchrony can be transformative. It regulates the autonomic nervous system. It stabilizes erratic emotional spikes. It enhances long-term planning. And above all, it prevents what we call cognitive drift, the tendency for intensely driven minds to lose themselves in their own momentum until they detach from their physical and emotional reality. Cognitive drift is dangerous. It leads to burnout, impulsive decision-making, and a loss of meaning. But the right presence, the right grounding person, acts like an anchor that keeps the mind from drifting too far into the abstract. Not to restrict it, but to keep it tethered just enough to function with extraordinary clarity. When you are responsible for technologies that reshape civilizations, when millions of people depend on your decisions, when your mind is constantly bending itself around the engineering of futures that do not yet exist, you do not need someone who stands in awe of you. You need someone who stands beside you, not impressed, not intimidated, simply present, solid, steady. The kind of presence that quiets the noise without silencing the mind. Because here is another truth that science has finally begun to articulate: greatness does not emerge from isolation. It emerges from regulated nervous systems, from emotional stability, from relational equilibrium. People imagine that high achievers operate alone, driven by pure willpower or some inherent resilience. In reality, most breakthroughs arise from the stability provided by a single relationship, a grounding force that allows the mind to operate at its peak without collapsing under its own intensity. And the fascinating thing is this: the grounding person is rarely the loudest one in the room. They are not the ones making headlines. They are not the ones people write biographies about. But they are the ones who stabilize the internal landscape of someone who seems larger than life. They know how to walk into a storm without getting swept away. They know how to speak into chaos and create order. They know how to stand in the gravitational pull of a mind that never stops and simply say without words, "I'm here. Keep going. You're safe." This kind of presence is not common. It is not something you can manufacture. It is biological, emotional, and deeply intuitive. And for a person whose mind has lived for decades in perpetual acceleration, finding someone who can provide this kind of equilibrium is nothing short of revolutionary. There is a moment, unmistakable when it arrives, when a person accustomed to carrying entire universes in their mind suddenly realizes that they no longer have to do it alone. And it doesn't happen because someone steps in and takes the weight. No. It happens because someone steps in and changes the structure of that weight. They distribute it. They absorb part of the emotional turbulence. They create a psychological buffer that the brain didn't even know it needed. And in that moment, a mind that has spent years bracing itself against its own momentum finally exhales. But grounding doesn't always look dramatic. It doesn't always announce itself. Often, it appears in the smallest of interactions: a sentence spoken at the right moment, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet look that recalibrates the entire emotional field. Human beings are sensory creatures. Our nervous systems react faster than our conscious thoughts. We know safety before we think it. We know connection before we explain it. And when a person who lives in the chaos of relentless innovation meets someone whose presence instantly reorganizes that chaos, it feels like a biological miracle. Imagine a mind that constantly runs multiple simulations at once, evaluating outcomes, analyzing risks, predicting futures, solving problems faster than they arise. This kind of mind does not rest. It doesn't have an off switch. But the grounding person creates something better than rest. They create coherence. Coherence is not stillness, it is synchronization. It is when the mind's many scattered frequencies align into a single, stable waveform. And when that happens, creativity is amplified, not diminished. People often misinterpret geniuses as chaotic, unpredictable, unmanageable. But the truth is more nuanced. Genius is delicate. It is sensitive to emotional imbalance. It requires stability as much as it requires intensity. And the person who can provide that stability, without muting the fire, without constraining the vision, becomes essential in ways that defy simple explanation. There are countless historical examples of this phenomenon. Scientists whose greatest breakthroughs happened only after forming a relationship with someone who grounded them emotionally. Inventors who moved from scattered experimentation to world-changing clarity once they found a stabilizing presence. Visionaries whose erratic energy became focused, sharp, and unstoppable because someone walked into their life and said, without ever needing to say it, "You don't need to outrun yourself anymore." The brain is not a machine built for isolation. It is a system designed for connection. We talk a lot about independence, but neuroscience shows that interdependence is what unlocks peak performance. The presence of a grounding individual can reduce neural noise by nearly 40%. It can increase cognitive endurance. It can reshape emotional regulation patterns formed in childhood. It can shift the entire trajectory of a person's life, not by altering who they are, but by giving them the stability to become the fullest version of themselves. And here is where it becomes truly remarkable. The grounding person often has no idea they're doing it. They don't walk around thinking they're stabilizing a mind capable of reshaping humanity's relationship with technology. They simply exist in alignment with their own emotional depth. They carry an authenticity that cuts through noise. They possess a kind of calm that cannot be faked. And because of that, they become the equilibrium point for someone whose entire world is built on momentum. Think about the physics of rockets. A rocket doesn't ascend because everything around it is calm. It ascends because it has balance, controlled thrust, stabilized vectors, precise alignment. Without these factors, all that power becomes destructive instead of transformative. Human minds are no different. The more powerful the internal engine, the more essential the stabilizing presence. And when that presence arrives in the form of someone whose spirit is simultaneously soft and unshakable, the effect is profound. It is not about dependence. It is not about emotional fragility. It is about optimization. A rocket doesn't depend on a guidance system. It requires it to reach maximum altitude. Likewise, a highly driven human being doesn't rely on another person to think for them. They rely on them to create the emotional and cognitive coherence necessary to sustain extreme levels of performance. And here's something most people never consider. Grounding doesn't limit ambition. It refines it. It turns scattered brilliance into precise impact. It converts chaos into strategy, passion into execution, dreams into timelines. It provides the emotional bandwidth needed to make impossible decisions under impossible pressure. I have seen individuals who were once on the verge of burning out, consumed by their own internal wildfire, completely transform after finding the right grounding presence. Their work accelerated, their clarity deepened, their emotional resilience expanded, not because someone saved them, but because someone aligned with them. This alignment is not purely emotional, it is physiological. When two people form this kind of connection, their brains begin to operate like a coupled system. Heart rates synchronize, breathing patterns mirror, neural oscillations harmonize, and in that harmony, new levels of cognition become possible. Decisions become cleaner, thoughts become sharper, the future becomes easier to hold. But there is something even more important. The grounding person reminds the innovator, the dreamer, that they are still human, that they are not merely an instrument for building the future, but a living being with needs, vulnerabilities, and emotions. The grounding person becomes the mirror that reflects humanity back to someone who often forgets their own. Because when you spend your life thinking in planetary scales, it becomes dangerously easy to neglect your own emotional gravity. You start treating your feelings like optional software rather than essential firmware. You start believing you can outthink your biology, outrun your trauma, outpace your anxiety. But no one can, not even the brightest minds. The grounding presence says in their own silent way, "You don't need to be invincible with me." And those words, even unspoken, can alter the entire architecture of a life. ChatGPT said, and so, in the final reckoning, the true measure of genius is not only in the audacity of one's ideas or the speed of one's mind, but in the capacity to be held steady while soaring. To be tethered, not tethered in limitation, but tethered in trust. To find someone who can walk alongside you in the hurricane of your own thoughts, and simply provide the invisible scaffolding that allows you to rise higher than you ever thought possible. This grounding presence, this rare alignment of minds and hearts, becomes the silent co-architect of monumental achievements. They are the reason that a mind capable of reshaping the world does not self-destruct under its own intensity. They are the reason that dreams are translated into plans, and plans into reality. And perhaps most importantly, they are the reason that a life driven by relentless pursuit of the extraordinary remains at its core profoundly human. I want you to think about this in your own lives. How many of us are so focused on acceleration, on progress, on the next breakthrough, that we forget the stabilizing forces around us? How many of us neglect the relationships, the quiet presences, the grounding anchors that allow our brains, hearts, and spirits to operate at their fullest potential. In our obsession with achievement, we often overlook the subtle, transformative power of someone who simply aligns with us, who brings coherence to our chaos, clarity to our cluttered thoughts, and calm to our storm. It is not flashy. It is not headline-grabbing. It does not come with trophies or applause. But it is the invisible engine behind every extraordinary trajectory. It is the difference between brilliance that burns out and brilliance that endures, between ideas that flicker and fade and ideas that ignite revolutions. And the remarkable truth is that the most powerful grounding presences often do not know the scale of their impact. They simply show up consistently with empathy, presence, and unwavering steadiness. Ladies and gentlemen, the lesson here is profound. No matter how far your ambitions take you, no matter how high your mind soars, there is immeasurable power in grounding. There is genius in stability. There is triumph in the quiet influence of someone who chooses, day after day, to align themselves with another's vision, to hold the balance while the world bends and shakes around them. It is a partnership with life itself, a recognition that even the wildest spirit cannot thrive in perpetual turbulence, and that the most extraordinary journeys are made possible, not by relentless force alone, but by harmony, trust, and the subtle but inexhaustible strength of being steadied by another. So I leave you with this: seek the presences that anchor you. Be the presence that steadies others. Understand that greatness is not a solo expedition. It is an intricate dance of mind and heart, of fire and equilibrium. And in finding that balance, in finding that rare alignment, we unlock not only the potential within ourselves, but the boundless possibilities of the human spirit. Because it is in that alignment, in that rare, extraordinary union of freedom and grounding, that we discover what it truly means to be unstoppable, profoundly human, and capable of changing the world. And with that, I thank you.